Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lahu wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh. Amma ba'du, fa'uzu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. This khutbah today is a continuation of last week's khutbah under the topic, this world as it would be in the future in the Quran. And I'll recite a few verses which I will be covering in this khutbah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قال الله تعالى في القرآن الحكيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وإذا الإشارة طلت وإذا الوحوش حشرت وإذا البحار سجرت وإذا النفوس زوجت وإذا الموءودة سئلت بأي ذنب قتلت وإذا الصحف نشرت وإذا السماء كشطت صدق الله العظيم. In last Friday's khutbah, I had covered up to verse 4 of chapter 81, which is the first verse that I've recited today, which translates as, "And when the camels are abandoned." And if I read in translation the verses which I've recited just now, it is, "And when the camels are abandoned, and when the wild animals are gathered together, and when the cities are made to swell, and when people are united, and when the one buried alive is asked for what sin she was killed, and when the books are spread, and when the heaven has its covering removed." Now, as I was just saying, in last Friday's khutbah, I had covered up to this verse, "and when the camels are abandoned." And I mentioned that Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, founder of the Ahmadiyya movement, put forward this prophecy in support of his claim. And he said that at the time of his coming, a new form of transport, the railway train he mentioned, has emerged, which has replaced the use of camels. So much so, he wrote, that a railway line is being constructed to connect Medina with Mecca. Now, I mentioned that this railway line was part of a railway line being constructed by the Ottoman rulers of that region to run from Damascus to Medina and then to Mecca. However, the section from Medina to Mecca was cancelled, and under that scheme it was never built. And this gave an opportunity to the opponents of Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad to allege that this prophecy had not been fulfilled of camels being abandoned. And a well-known opponent of Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad Sahib, who was a young man in his time, Maulana Sanaullah Amritsari, as I mentioned last week, he wrote in his Urdu commentary of the Quran, Tafsir Sanai, that although the railway from Medina to Mecca would have been useful for Muslims, yet Allah stopped its construction in order to belie what Mirza Ghulam Ahmad was saying, and to save Muslims, therefore, from the error of believing that Mirza Ghulam Ahmad was right, that this prophecy was fulfilled. And this is a strange argument by Maulana Sanaullah, who says that Allah deprived Muslims of the convenience and safety of going to Mecca by railway train. Allah did that just to falsify the claim of Hazrat Mirza Sahib. Yet, if I may point out, Allah had allowed European powers to build railway lines all over their colonies, which facilitated Christian missionaries to go to those countries to spread Christianity. And this included their going to countries where Muslims were living, such as India, under British rule, and then defaming Islam and the Holy Prophet Muhammad. So Allah, it seems, didn't stop them from building railways, but He stopped Muslims from doing it, according to Maulana Sanaullah, just to belie Hazrat Mirza Sahib. Anyhow, moving to the next verse, verse 5, which is, and when the wild animals are gathered together. And this can be seen fulfilled in our modern scientific times. The first zoo, which was created only for scientific purposes, was London Zoo in 1828. And then subsequently, animals from all over the world were gathered in zoos in major cities in the world. So people could see animals from all those remote places, all gathered together. And then in recent years, wildlife reserves have been developed around the world to provide protected areas for animals who are under threat of extinction by human development. And this is also a gathering of wild animals. But we are also familiar with television documentaries about the natural world, which show us animals living and behaving in their original environments. And we can say that, in a sense, this means that animals from all over the world are gathered before us in our homes. And the main purpose of such broadcasts is to increase our knowledge. Moving on to verse 6, which has been translated in our translation as, and when the cities are made to swell. This has been so obviously fulfilled, not only now, but it started being fulfilled shortly before the time of Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad. And this swelling of the cities was due to what is called the Industrial Revolution. In Europe and the USA, cities had to grow to accommodate workers for the new factories, the workers who moved from villages and rural areas to urban areas. So cities, as we know, have continued to swell all the time. But that is our translation. The more common translations of this verse are along the following lines. Some are along this line, when the seas are made to overflow or to swell. Seas, that is oceans. And the other type of translation is, when the seas are set on fire. Seas meaning ocean, just to be clear. Now, if you take the first type of translation, the seas are made to overflow, then interestingly, if we look at the translation by Marmaduke Picathol, his translation is, when the seas rise. And his translation fits in with the rise in sea levels taking place in our times, or which has been noticed in our times, which you hear commonly mentioned in the news and is studied in science. Now, Picathol produced his translation in 1930, when at that time the rise in sea levels was unheard of. So Mr. Picathol could not have been influenced by any knowledge about rising sea levels when he was translating these words as, when the seas rise. And if you take the second type of translation of this verse, when the seas are set on fire. Well, this was also fulfilled in the naval battles of the 20th century, the First and the Second World Wars, and probably other wars as well, when ships were bombarded, ships of navies were bombarded, and in fact other ships as well, transporting goods, were bombarded in the seas while traveling, and they would then be burning in the sea. Not that the sea itself would be burning. If we now move on to the next verse 7, which again has been translated by us, that is to say by Maulana Muhammad Ali, as when people are united. Wazan nufuso zuwajat. The word here for people is nafs, which also means soul. And the word here for united, zuwajat, means for two things to be paired or coupled to each other. Hence, that is also used for the marital relationship. Zaj. Now, those who apply these descriptions in chapter 81 to the Day of Judgment, they interpret this to mean that the souls of the dead on the Day of Judgment will be united with their bodies, so that people will physically rise from the dead. But if we apply it to this world and take this verse in the sense of when people are united, then again this found increasing fulfillment from the 20th century onwards till now. Of course, you can say humanity is not united. It remains divided into nations who are sometimes at war with each other. But at the same time, the need has been realized for setting up international bodies in all fields of life, such as in human welfare, like the International Labour Organization, human rights, the fields of science, education, or even politics. And these international bodies bring people together from various sections of humanity who share some common interest or goal. There is also, of course, the United Nations, and that, while of course being far from perfect in practice, certainly it reflects its aim in its title, the United Nations. Now, if you take this verse, when the people are united, if you take the united part, as I've said, zuwajat, in the sense of pairing or coupling, just consider the example of the telephone. The telephone was invented in 1876, and it came into public use very quickly. This was also about the year when Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad Sahib first started writing articles and books. Anyhow, the telephone paired people together. You have one person on one phone and the other person on the other phone talking to each other, and they are paired or coupled. And these days, at any time, there must be billions of such pairs of people talking to each other at any given time. So you could say the people are paired. Then the next verses, which is 8 and 9, they say, and when the one buried alive is asked for what sin she was killed. Now the words, the one buried alive, refer to the infant daughters who in pre-Islamic times were buried alive in Arabia due to a cruel custom by which some people were ashamed to have daughters. Now, these verses, when the one buried alive is asked, cannot refer to the day of judgment, because those questioned about their deeds on the day of judgment will be the wrongdoers and not the victims of wrongdoing. So this really refers to this world. And this expression simply indicates that people will become conscious that baby girls who had been buried alive were entirely innocent and faultless and killed without any justification whatsoever in an act of murder. The Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam immediately abolished and outlawed this custom as soon as he acquired power and rule over his people in Arabia. In China and India, killing of baby daughters, female infanticide, has been occurring from ancient times till today. You could say that it has got worse now because with the advent of technology, which enables the sex of a baby to be determined before birth, as you will know, there have been cases where people have been resorting to abortion if the sex of the unborn child is known to be female. And this is worse because unlike actual child killing, the perpetrators don't feel that they have taken a life when they conduct or have conducted that kind of abortion, because they don't see any living being being murdered in front of them. So these verses speak of the coming of a time when such customs will be universally condemned and outlawed everywhere, as they are. Now, the next verse 10 tells us when the books are spread. Those who apply this to the day of judgment, they say, well, the books of deed of every person will be opened before them on that day, so the books will be spread. But it's easy to see how this has been fulfilled in the world in front of us. Before paper was available in Europe, which is, say, maybe 600 or 700 years ago, writing materials were very expensive, and of course books were hand-produced. And about 800 years ago in Britain, the price of an ordinary book could be as much as the price of a house. And then paper came to Europe from the Muslim world, where it was already in use. And the Muslim world itself had learnt about the use of paper from China. But in the Muslim world, of course, books were still being calligraphed by hand, and in Europe as well. And then the printing press was invented about 500 years ago in Europe, and therefore books in Europe became much cheaper and plentiful and spread to the ordinary public. This availability of books gave a huge impetus to education, to learning, and to study and research. And it also made possible the production of newspapers and magazines, because, as you will know, these need to be printed frequently, unlike books. You might take several years to produce a book, and it might not matter. But newspapers and magazines are only possible, or only became possible, when the printing press was invented. And so you could print things frequently. And the word for books in this verse was the sohofo noshirat. Sohof means any kind of writing, and newspapers and magazines fall in this category. And in Britain, the first newspapers appeared about 300 years ago. Now, in the past 40 years or so, with the development of digital technology, huge numbers of books are now available online, accessible to anyone, whether they are at home or traveling, and books which previously spread only as far as libraries, schools, other institutions, and bookshops, they have now become spread at every location, wherever you may be, online. And moving on to the next verse 11, which is the last one I'll be dealing with here. When the heaven has its covering removed. Some translate it as when the heaven is laid bare, or when the sky is stripped away, or when the heavens are unveiled. In other words, they have the veil removed, burqa removed. Now again, this has been applied to what will happen on the Day of Judgment, but it applies in this modern world. Heaven has its covering removed. Because books and writings, as mentioned in the previous verse, they spread knowledge. So books and writings had to be filled with new material. And this encouraged, in fact, it necessitated the discovering of new knowledge through research to spread through books and writings. And as a result of those researches, what was previously mysterious and unknown about the heavens which are above us, all that became discovered and known to human beings, even with no person having left the earth, even in those days. But of course, now with space travel, the heavens are now open to human beings to send spacecrafts to, spacecrafts which might not have any human beings on board, and those which are manned. And as we learnt only this week, India, a country which the outside world associates with illiteracy, lack of education, and poverty, and in fact these are widespread there. India has successfully landed a spacecraft on a part of the moon which is difficult to reach. And the Holy Quran itself says in a chapter which is 2 chapters before this chapter 81, there's a verse in it saying, and the heaven is opened so it becomes like doors. Chapter 79, verse 19. So, heaven becoming like doors means that opening, a heaven becoming open like doors means that you go through into it. Chapter 79, verse 19. And then to sum this up, Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad Sahib has written that these prophecies are mentioned in the Quran so that when they are fulfilled by these new developments in transport and communications, they should be used by us for spreading the message of Islam. And also mankind in general should realize that just as by studying the world around us, mankind has acquired unimaginable benefits for our worldly lives, unimaginable before. Similarly, by studying the Word of God, they can acquire unimaginable benefits for their moral and spiritual lives, and may they do so. Ameen. Barakallahu lana wa lakum fil Quranil Azim wa nafa'na wa iyyakum bil ayati wa zikril hakim. Innahu ta'ala jawadun karimun malikum barurur rahim.